Good afternoon, good morning, or good evening, everybody, depending on where you're joining us from. My name is Emilie Max, and I work as a researcher at the Geneva Academy of International Humanitarian Law and Human Rights. It is my great pleasure to be moderating today's seminar on COVID-19 vaccination in situations of armed conflict. And before I will present our panelists, let me just tell you a few words about our institution. So the Geneva Academy is an academic institution. We provide postgraduate education and undertake research on all the branches related to the conduct of armed conflict. We have 3 postgraduate programs and a research department. And as part of our research activities, we organize events such as the one today. We call them the IHL Talks. It's a series of 6 or 7 events per year on topics that are relevant to international humanitarian law or policy, and that are contemporary and of interest for policymakers, practitioners, but also academics. And this is the 3rd event of 2021, and we are always looking for suggestions on topics that you might be interested for us to delve in, so please don't hesitate to reach out with suggestions. As mentioned, today the event is on COVID-19 vaccination, and we have 3 distinguished panelists with us today that I'm happy to introduce in no particular order of importance or prominence. So first of all, we have Eitan Diamond. Eitan is the desk manager and senior legal expert of the Jerusalem desk of Diakonia's International Humanitarian Law Center. We also have Charles Deutscher, who is a policy advisor in the Policy and Humanitarian Diplomacy Division of the International Committee of the Red Cross. And last but not least, we have Jimena Galvez Lima joining us from Bolivia today, who is the Regional Legal and Policy Coordinator for Eurasia with Geneva Co. Each of them will have about 15 minutes for their respective presentations. And then hopefully we will have a good 45 minutes for interaction with you, our participants. You will not be able to use your video or microphone, but please do ask questions or make comments in the chat feature. I will take them on a first come, first served basis, or might group them in clusters if some of them address the same or similar issues. And without further ado, I will first give the floor to Charles for his presentation.
Thanks, Emily, and thank you for the opportunity to share a few policy and operational considerations for COVID-19 vaccination campaigns during conflict. I can speak only for myself, but here in Geneva, I'd say that COVID-19 is still pretty high up on the list of factors affecting my everyday life and decisions. But I wanted to start with an observation that our Director General made on returning from Gaza last week. He said that when he visited Al-Shifa hospital, he saw over 30 people who were seriously ill from COVID-19, but didn't hear once anyone asking for COVID-19 vaccines. What he heard amidst the rubble and the grief were people asking after water, medicine, shelter, and other essentials. And that is the reality of many places, for people in many places that we work in, where COVID, of course, is just one other deadly threat among a litany of others. And I think that's a point that's easy to acknowledge in theory, but if you really stop to think about it and what you would do if you and your family were in a similar situation, I think it becomes clear how COVID can have a greater or lesser importance, depending on your point of view. And this obviously shouldn't change whether we do COVID-19 vaccinations in conflict settings, but I'd suggest it should change how we do them. And taking a step back from this subject matter, I think we should acknowledge that the limited overall supply of COVID-19 vaccines is definitely the main constraint on equitable distribution between countries. And so any effort that is made in that regard is obviously welcome. But far less attention has been paid on equitable distribution within countries. And that's why this discussion, I think, is such a timely one. And here we're talking about what happens when vaccines arrive, wherever they come from, arrive in Aden or another port of entry. Suffice to say, it's not as straightforward as it is in Switzerland, where you register online, show up at your vaccination center at the allotted time and go on your merry way, or at least protected from COVID-19 after a day or two of queasiness. A volatile security situation like we've seen in Gaza over the past months evidently compounds the challenges of carrying out vaccination activities, as well as pandemic preparedness and response measures more generally. In conflict settings, hospitals are destroyed, planning, cold chain and logistics are weak, qualified health personnel are scarce, and those who remain are attacked. Government funding is dried up, and some populations are cut off from services altogether. So it's more expensive, it's more risky, and it's more time consuming than in non-conflict settings. But if I have one message today, it's that while vaccination activities in conflict settings is more difficult than in Switzerland, they are possible. It's possible and it can be done. They have been done with routine vaccinations or immunizations before. And more than the technical and financial challenges, more even than the security challenges, the biggest challenges are in fact political, regarding the inclusion of and access to certain populations in national vaccination plans and activities, and around the narrative surrounding vaccines as public health interventions. And so I wanted to kind of offer three considerations in this light, which won't be anything new, I'm sure, to many people in the audience, but which are nonetheless critical to the success of vaccination activities in conflict settings. And in a way, that's the point. Every context is different, but the fundamentals are the same and pretty well known. So first of all, to fail to plan is to plan to fail. Everybody needs to be included in national vaccination plans and activities, no matter who they are and no matter what their legal status is. And this is as important for epidemiological and economic reasons as it is for moral and humanitarian ones. By one estimate, for example, over 70% of epidemics in the 3 decades to 2009, the statistics are a bit old, but the principle remains, originated in conflict settings. And part of the reason for that is that those health systems have been damaged by conflict over many years, and therefore they constitute amplifiers of disease, which can obviously cross international borders, as we've seen, just as quickly as they can cross front lines. And so this inclusion is fundamentally a state responsibility, because they are responsible for the health of populations in their territories. But it might not be so straightforward in a conflict setting. Undocumented migrants or displaced populations, for example, may be hesitant to present themselves to authorities for fear of status or other ramifications. The health of the 1 million+ detainees that the ICRC visits every year can lie with ministries of interior rather than ministries of health, and that complicates planning and coordination. And hopefully Zimera will touch on this later, but that the health situation of the 60 to 80 million people that we estimate to be living in areas controlled by non-state armed groups is really a big blind spot on international surveillance. And so in part for these reasons and due to these challenges, the ICRC, together with other organizations and Gavi, have been working to develop a humanitarian buffer, which is basically a small reserve stock of vaccines that's designed as a last resort for populations or people who, despite state's best efforts, are left behind. And happy to take questions on that if there's any interest in the Q&A. But the second consideration I wanted to offer is that vaccinations, COVID-19 vaccinations, shouldn't be standalone activities, but rather should be part of a broader public health strategy, which includes routine immunizations and a strong community engagement component. And this is both to bring longer-term improvements to people's health and access to healthcare, a huge resource mobilization around COVID now that we can leverage, but also to foster acceptance of COVID-19 vaccination campaigns themselves, which, as I mentioned earlier, might not be people's top priority. So why would I contend that strong community engagement, genuine community engagement, is as important to the success of COVID-19 vaccination campaigns as are qualified health workers? Well, because vaccines won't protect against COVID-19, only vaccination will. And because people are more likely to trust people that they know rather than experts that they don't. And this is especially where some parties may be spreading disinformation or have taken an active stand against a particular type of vaccine as Al-Shabaab have in Somalia. In other words, the messenger is just as important as the message. So it's critical that we understand the drivers of any hesitancy in the communities concerned. Is it lack of awareness or understanding? Is it mistrust or fear, security, or something else? And I think more positively, we need to build the conditions conducive to vaccine acceptance, and so the campaign is recognised as something that's good and it's going to bring benefit. Because sometimes I think it's a misrepresentation to say that people are hesitant about vaccines. Sometimes I think they're more often hesitant about the manner in which vaccination activities are carried out. And by way of example here, I'd look to the experience from past epidemics, especially Ebola in West Africa. That experience shows not only that using armed actors to coerce and in some cases force people to be vaccinated doesn't work, and in fact only exacerbates vaccine hesitancy. It also shows that stigma associated with healthcare workers, stigma meaning the stigma that they would transmit the virus even though they are the ones charged with containing it, results in further stigmatization and attacks against them. And it shows that such stigmatization or misperceptions can result in people being fearful to seek access to health services generally. And by some estimates, I think it was MSF, suggested that more people died for fear or not seeking routine health services during Ebola than from Ebola itself, which is a pretty telling point. And I think this is especially the case in non-international armed conflicts, where parts of the population may have a mistrust against health workers that they perceive to be associated with the state. And so, obviously building trust and acceptance with communities and arms carriers alike is part and parcel of humanitarian action generally, but in the public health space, I think, despite the rhetoric, it's still under-resourced. It takes time, effort, and money, but it works. And one experience from a past assignment that will always stick in my mind was from Myanmar before the pandemic. And we would organize meetings in remote areas with government health staff on one side of a trestle table, health staff associated with a non-state armed group on the other side of a trestle table. And we would speak about vaccine coverage, dengue prevention, and referral pathways. And those parties would not have come together, I think it's fair to say, without the ICRC acting as a neutral intermediary and without having been there in that area with the community for 30 years. In addition, I think we should also remember that routine vaccinations have taken a massive hit because of the focus on COVID-19, and yet the diseases that they protect against have so far killed far more people. There are real concerns, for example, about renewed outbreaks of measles, which is one of the world's most contagious diseases and whose incidence hit a 23-year high last year. And if you search images of infants with measles, you'll see it's a pretty horrendous disease, which is also entirely preventable. And so from a humanitarian perspective, it's clear that we need to do COVID-19 vaccinations in addition to, not at the expense of, routine vaccinations. And it's true that they do target different age groups, but they can be coordinated, and the campaigns can act, pardon the pun, as vectors to bring other health services to underserved communities. Third, and finally, as Eden will know better than me, IHL provides a framework to ensure access to vaccines and combat the pandemic in conflict. It includes obligations on parties to the conflict to prevent and contain epidemics, for example, the health and hygiene, safeguarding the health and hygiene of detainees and displaced populations. And it protects vaccinations as medical activities, as well as those administering the vaccines and humanitarian action for vaccination purposes. And on that last point, and recalling again that equitable access is fundamentally a state responsibility, sometimes working through a humanitarian organization like the ICRC might be the best way to secure access for certain people along the last mile. And so our delegations, together with National Red Cross and Red Crescent societies, are working with governments and other actors to prepare the ground, shall we say, for COVID-19 vaccinations, while continuing routine ones in so far 28 countries. So in Ukraine, for example, we're supporting vaccination activities along the line of contact, including cold chain, in Mauritania, doing the same for detainees and prison staff, in Iraq, supporting over 600 vaccination centers, and in the Philippines, in active discussions with the government and non-state parties about vaccination activities in East Mindanao. And so with that, and in closing for now, as we move through the summer in Europe and more people are vaccinated, the urgency and hype around COVID vaccinations could wane. But everyone should be concerned that both routine and COVID vaccinations continue in armed conflict settings, if not for moral and humanitarian reasons, then certainly for epidemiological and economic ones. You know, the title of today's event is Against the Clock, and we are working against the clock. Even in developed country health systems, there's concern about variants, and there was a time when here in Geneva, all ICU beds were full. So imagine now if those variants came and a surge in cases of the kind we've seen in India happened at a country at war whose health system is already weak and struggling to cope with the basic needs of the population. And much rides on how vaccinations are done as well, because not only will that have implications for the future of all kinds of vaccination activities in the future, but also for trust in government and public health responses more generally. So the challenges are definitely numerous, and health specialists know them better than me, but vaccination in conflict settings is possible, and ensuring that vaccination plans are comprehensive, that they form part of a broader approach, and that IHL is respected will go a long way to helping us beat this pandemic and better prepare for the next one. So let me stop there and welcome questions in the Q&A. Thanks, Emily.
Thanks, Charles, for this presentation. And it's also nice to start one of these talks on a hopeful note, rather, than just highlighting challenges. But I've taken away that vaccines work, but only vaccination campaigns make them effective. And thanks also for highlighting the legal framework. I think that Eitan will develop on with a focus on occupied territories, but also for highlighting issues with regards to trusts, specifically in non-international armed conflict. And Jimena will probably address those with a focus on non-state actors later. So Eitan, without further ado, I will give you the floor and here.
Thanks very much, Emily. And thanks also on behalf of Diaconia for giving us this opportunity to speak at this forum. I'm going to try and share my screen. I hope you can see. Okay, great. So as was mentioned, I'm going to be speaking about IHL or legal obligations with respect to COVID-19 with a focus on occupied territories. And perhaps before speaking more specifically about the law, it's useful for the benefit of those of you who are less familiar with the law on occupied territories to point out some of the, or perhaps the most distinguishing feature of situations of occupations, which cause them to differ a bit from other situations regulated by IHL. And that is the fact that in situations of occupation, the occupying power, this foreign power, has effective control over the population of occupied territory. So population over whom it has no sovereign claim. And as a consequence of this effective power exercised by this foreign power, this occupying power, the local sovereign is unable to discharge its governmental functions. And what international law strives to do in this situation is to intervene and make sure that the basic needs of the population, the ones that the sovereign, the rightful sovereign, which is currently ousted, cannot perform, that these are provided for. And it, in a way, requires the occupying power to step in the shoes of the sovereign and to perform certain governmental functions. There's a governmental vacuum, and the occupying power has to fill that vacuum. And that applies with respect to many areas of life, including health services. So that's going to be the focus now. And I'm just having some trouble here with the, let's see. Okay, great. So I'll start by pointing out the two legal frameworks through which international law intervenes in the situation where you have a foreign power controlling population, a foreign population. So the first, of course, is international humanitarian law, which contains a set of provisions, which are sometimes referred to as the law of occupation. These are quite old, actually. You can find many of them in the Hague Regulations from 1907. And these were complemented in 1949 in the wake of the Second World War with the Fourth Geneva Convention. So those are the sources. And in these situations, international humanitarian law imposes all kinds of obligations on the occupying power. In addition, though some differ, but our position, fortunately shared by many, including the International Court of Justice, is that in times of armed conflict, international human rights law continues to apply, and it certainly applies in occupied territory. The occupying power is bound by not only by international humanitarian law, but also by provisions of international human rights law. Now, I don't have too much time to speak about in detail about debates about the scope of obligations that an occupying power has under these two legal frameworks. But perhaps just stepping back a bit, I can say something about the sort of underlying logic for imposing obligations, both from IHL and from human rights law. And that really is that the fact that the occupying power exerts power or control over population, basically the fact that they're at its mercy, that they cannot, this population cannot realize its rights, their basic interests cannot be fulfilled without the intervention of this occupying power. That's the sort of underlying reason why both international humanitarian law and international human rights law impose obligations. The scope of control or power that the occupying power has over the population dictates the scope of its obligations. I'm simplifying somewhat, but at a very kind of architectural level, that's the point. And then when there are situations where other actors also have influence or power, they also have obligations. And we'll see how that plays out, perhaps if we have enough time, particularly if I can refer to an example of an occupation. But I want to begin now by relating a little bit to the legal framework. And I'll speak both about IHL and human rights law, and I'll start with obligations derived from IHL. And really there are four main provisions that I want to focus on here. I'll start with Article 43 of the Hague Regulations of 1907 that I mentioned before, and this is really a core provision of the whole of the law of occupation. Wasn't translated very well into English from the binding French. I put the French there, which is binding in this case, just so that you can understand why, although it says safety in English, the obligation that is imposed on the occupying power is to ensure civil life. And that has been interpreted as a robust obligation with respect to all kinds of areas of life, certainly including health, among others by the Israeli Supreme Court. Israel, as you will know, has had a long history of occupation over Palestine, and there's a considerable body of jurisprudence, and there it has been established that civil life is this rather expansive concept, certainly includes obligations with respect to health. So that's the first, almost a kind of constitutional principle that's relevant here. Next, turning now to the Fourth Geneva Convention, where we'll find the other relevant provisions. First, we find Article 55 of the Fourth Geneva Convention, which establishes a duty to provide medical supplies. This is not a duty to allow others to do that. This is a duty that's imposed on the occupying power itself directly. So because of its control, again, it has an obligation to ensure all sorts of things, including the provision of medical supplies for the occupied territory. Next, the article right after that elaborates a duty to ensure and maintain health services. And you can see there's some detail in the provision. I just wanted to flag here a couple of points. So at the end, you'll see that there's specific reference to combating the spread of contagious diseases and epidemics. So the occupying power has an obligation with respect to that. But it's supposed to do this with the cooperation of national and local authorities. In general, the law aspires to interfere as little as possible with the autonomy of the local population. Obviously, under occupation, that's seriously compromised, but there is an effort to allow local authorities to continue to function. And with respect to ensuring and maintaining health services, this is supposed to be, that the law explicitly states that it's supposed to be done in cooperation with national and local authorities. we'll touch on this a bit in a moment again. And finally, these are two provisions that are quite closely related here. And they both establish a duty to allow and facilitate the provision of medical supplies. So in addition to the obligations that the occupying power itself has to provide medical supplies, it is also obliged to allow and to in fact facilitate the provision by others, by third states, by humanitarian organizations. So if for any reason it itself is not able to provide for the occupied population, it has these obligations to allow others to do so. So this was very quickly a kind of review of some of the key provisions in IHL. And as I mentioned, human rights law is also applicable. And so here I'd start with Article 12 of the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, which establishes the right of everyone to the enjoyment of the highest attainable standard of physical and mental health. So that's a general duty that states have to facilitate the realization of this right. And there's, among other things, a specific reference to the fact that states have to take steps to achieve full realization, including those necessary for the prevention, treatment, and control of epidemics, etc. So again, a specific reference to countering epidemics. Here, just earlier in the same covenant, there's a general provision relating to all the rights regulated there that establishes that states have to undertake steps, both individual, but also through international assistance and cooperation to achieve the realization of these rights. So it's not only that a state has an obligation itself to work towards the realization of the right to health, but it also has to work and cooperate with others. Some details about how this right is supposed to be applied have been provided by General Comment 14 by the UN Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, interpreting Article 12 that I referred to before. And these include the clarification that essential elements for the realization of the right to health are its availability. So people have to have the health services available and accessible to them. Acceptability, so they have to be adapted to the community and have to be acceptable by that community and of good quality. And in addition to that, another principle derived from human rights law is that the services must be provided in a non-discriminatory manner. Now, I mentioned before that human rights law applies in occupied territory as an independent source of law. But in addition to that, it also informs the interpretation of international humanitarian law. So the provisions that I cited before, for example, Article 56 of the Fourth Geneva Convention, have to be interpreted in light of these kinds of principles that have been elucidated in the discourse around human rights law. So, for example, commitment to the non-discriminatory provision of the services is applicable in IHL as well. Okay, now I've tried quite quickly to go through the legal framework in some degree of abstraction. At Diaconia, we've looked, these are some of the publications that we've published on this. We've looked at the case of the Palestinian territory and the obligations to provide COVID-19 vaccines to the population of the occupied Palestinian territory. And so these are, I encourage you to actually look at these on our website, because I won't be able to go into full detail about what we've uncovered in this research, but I do want to touch on some principles. So first of all, there are some complicating factors there that were true in this case and may arise in other situations of occupation as well. And that is that there's a need to allocate responsibility between different actors. So Israel is the occupying power. It has the obligations derived from the law of occupation, from human rights law, but there are other players involved. The Palestinian Authority exerts a certain degree of authority in occupied Palestine. And in the Gaza Strip, there are de facto authorities controlled by the Hamas that also perform governmental functions de facto. And so there's a need to allocate responsibility between these various actors. In general, their obligations are connected to the level of control they have over the territory and over the population. So the greater control, the greater the obligations, simplifying again. And the scope of their obligations also depends on the means and resources they each have at their disposal. And I will point out that Israel, as the dominant power here, with the most influence, also has the most robust obligations on our analysis. There have been some references in the discourse around this to an agreement that was reached between the PLO and Israel, the PLO as a representative of the Palestinian people in the Oslo Accords, where Israel agreed that issues relating to health services would be under the responsibility of the Palestinian Authority. And the argument that was raised by some Israeli officials and others arguing on behalf of Israel was that this agreement discharged Israel of obligations with respect to health in the occupied territory, including obligations with respect to the provision of COVID-19 vaccines. Now, we reject this position. We reject it based on the provisions of the Fourth Geneva Convention, which establishes that an occupying power can't relieve itself of its obligations under the law of occupation through a bilateral agreement with the party under occupation. The rationale behind that is that it would be very easy for the occupying power to abuse its power to create and to reach an agreement that would serve its interest and discharge it of its obligations. So while the law encourages allowing local authorities to perform governmental functions, if they're unable to do so or they fail to do so, ultimate responsibility rests with the occupying power. Now, when it comes to how the obligations play out, we identify different stages in the provision of vaccines and other health services. So the first relates to the actual duty to supply the vaccine. So in this case, it would mean ensuring that the vaccines reach into the occupied territory. And here the obligation, the ultimate obligation and the party with the most robust obligation is Israel as an occupying power, and that derives from the provisions we looked at before. So Article 43 of the Hague Regulations, Article 55 of the Fourth Geneva Convention, and again, the fact that it has a duty to allow others when it doesn't do so itself and must facilitate the provision by others under Article 59 of the Fourth Geneva Convention. And in addition to these IHL-based obligations, there are obligations to supply the vaccine derived from the provision of human rights law that we looked at before. And this includes an obligation to ensure that this is done without discrimination. So, for example, not favoring the occupying power's own population over the population of the occupied territory. So that's the first stage. The second is ensuring the safe and rapid entry of vaccines into the occupied territory. So it's one thing to reach the border of the occupied territory, but then to ensure that the vaccines can actually enter the territory. And again, while Israel will not necessarily, and in practice, will not be the one actually transporting the vaccines once they enter the occupied territory, or at least the part of the territory controlled by Palestinian authorities, it does bear primary responsibility to ensure that this is made possible. So it can't, for example, hinder the passage of vaccines, and it actually has to take positive steps to facilitate passage. So, for example, to reduce administrative procedures that could complicate this. And finally, once the vaccines are in the occupied territory, there's a need to distribute them, to run a kind of vaccination plan to ensure that the population receives the vaccines that have been supplied. And here, the agreements reached in the Oslo Accords, the provision of Article 56 of the Fourth Geneva Convention that I mentioned before, which requires cooperation with the local authorities, actually kicks in. And the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, the de facto, well, actually the Palestinian Authority throughout Palestine and the de facto authorities in Gaza are responsible for ensuring that all aspects of the plan that they create for vaccination are implemented in an effective and equitable manner. Whereas Israel still has responsibilities to support these authorities in developing the vaccination campaign and ensuring that it operates. And again, it must allow and facilitate passage of vaccines to make this possible. Because Israel has control of movement between the West Bank and Gaza, these two parts of the occupied Palestinian territory, it's obliged to allow movement between these two parts so that the vaccines can reach their destinations. And also within the occupied territory, Israel has a presence in the West Bank and creates movement restrictions there. So it's not allowed to prevent the movement of the vaccines in that occupied territory. So that's kind of a quick overview of the obligations that that these various players have. And in closing, I'll try to do this really quickly. There are also obligations that third states have. And these derive in part from human rights law. So from human rights, there's an obligation on all states to do the maximum that they can do to facilitate access to essential health goods, including in this case to Palestinians in the occupied Palestinian territories. From customary international law, there's an obligation to refrain from rendering any aid or assistance in the commission of violations of international law that might hamper equitable access to vaccines. So if Israel, for example, is committing a violation that disrupts the provision, then states are not allowed to aid or assist that. And they also have to exert influence that they have, in this case over Israel, to put an end to any such violations of international humanitarian law, including those violations that might compromise access to vaccines. And that derives from Common Article 1 to the Geneva Conventions. So sorry if that was a bit quick, speedy, but I hope people were able to take that in. And I'll stop for now and would be happy to take questions. Thanks a lot.
Thanks a lot, Eitan. This was, well, a quick but quite an exhaustive presentation that went from, the very specifics of the law and the general to providing examples of an ongoing, occupation that is also well known. And I also guess it provided a good overview of the divisions of responsibility or the division of labor between the various actors that operate in one territory, and also third states, so showing that it's about working together to make vaccination campaign a reality, and it's not only one responsibility for one actors. And I guess that makes for a nice transition with our last panelists, because there are other actors operating in a territory that are not states, but not state armed groups. So without further ado, Jimena, I will give you the floor.
Thank you very much, Emily. And no, it's really a great pleasure for Geneva Call to be present today and discuss a bit about what we have been seeing for 2020, 2021 concerning the different approaches that armed non-state actors have been adopting to fight against COVID-19. Indeed, these have been quite different responses to the different situations, as not all regions have been impacted the same way when it started. So of course, we can see some differences in some of the measures. But so we will first start by giving a brief overview of what the organization does, what Geneva Call does, who we are, in case there are some participants who don't know what we do. And then we'll focus more on what has been our COVID-19 response monitor, how we have been tracking the different measures and responses from armed groups, as well as some challenges and some solutions that we have proposed throughout the assessment of these responses. And then we will talk a bit more about vaccination. But from the get-go, it's quite important for me to mention from the outset that vaccination by armed non-state actors and having access to vaccines, it remains an exception. It's not the rule yet, as it's quite challenging for them to access vaccines. And we're just seeing 5 to 6 armed groups who are, formally committed to carrying out vaccination within their areas, but then there's other aspects that need to be considered. So without further ado, let's start. First of all, who are we? We are a neutral, impartial, and independent humanitarian organization. We are Swiss-based. We aim to improve the protection of civilians in armed conflicts through humanitarian engagement with armed non-state actors on their respect for IHL and human rights law as well. So how do we do this? We do this, of course, through humanitarian engagement. Now, humanitarian engagement is such a broad concept. But indeed, humanitarian engagement, it involves many aspects, as long as you sustain constructive, processes of interaction with different armed non-state actors for humanitarian purposes solely. So in this sense, we do engage a broad variety of armed non-state actors, ranging from ethnic armed organizations, from pro-government militias to de facto authorities. So indeed, a big plethora of armed non-state actors. Now, since 2018, we have launched a new thematic, which we have been working so far on the protection of healthcare. We launched the deed of commitment, which is one of Geneva calls, I would say, pride and joy tools, which is a unilateral declaration containing minimal obligations that need to be complied with by armed groups and that they commit to sign and abide. So in this context, we have been working on the protection of healthcare, which has allowed us to do a lot of work during the COVID-19 context and of the whole crisis. You can see here below a picture of one of the campaigns that we were doing in Philippines, in Cotabato, on specific messages, quite digestible messages on the protection of healthcare in Maguindanaoan dialect. So moving on to the ANSA COVID-19 Response Monitor. So the ANSA COVID-19 Response Monitor was created as a complementary tool to Geneva Call's global COVID-19 advocacy strategy. What it aimed to do is basically serve as a database tracking the different measures and responses by armed groups around the world to COVID-19, not only on areas that were operational in, but also around the world. So you'll see countries where perhaps we're not operational in, but we have been able to verify some certain measures. Now, when we talk about measures and responses, there are some differences. When we talk about measures, we talk about concrete courses of action, specific activities or plans of action that armed groups have adopted or are implementing in order to address the COVID. When we talk about responses, these are more, I would say, reactions that are not concrete and that can be seen throughout statements of armed groups where they recognize the dangers of COVID-19 and the dangers of the spread. So here you can see a quick snapshot of what it looks like when you click on a specific country and you have a list of different armed groups in that specific country. You click on the specific armed group and you will have the different measures and responses that we have been able to verify with an according source that can be, of course, consulted if the audience requires. Now, the objectives of this COVID monitor is not only to complement, our global advocacy strategy, but we also aim to give more visibility about the measures that armed non-state actors were adopting in times of COVID. So we saw that many databases were created in times of COVID, to track disorders, to track, advances or issues with regards to the protection of cultural heritage in times of COVID. So again, we aim to address that gap. And so far, we have about 380 measures gathered within the database that are a wide variety of measures that we will look into further on, from more than 20 armed groups, from more than 70 armed groups, and in more than 24 different contexts around the world. Now, of course, this also supports Geneva Call's global monitoring efforts. We do indeed want to be informed. We have to inform our strategies in the different practices and policies that armed groups are adopting concerning the protection of healthcare and, of course, addressing COVID-19. But also, this COVID-19 response monitor facilitated coordination in some contexts between armed groups and government. So governments were, in some situations, were not aware of what was going on in non-governmental controlled areas. So some of them have used this database to try to see what's going on in those areas and try to address certain gaps that they may be, capable to address in those situations. Or if armed groups are, basically calling for support in certain areas because they lack, personal protective equipment, or they lack, awareness raising material, it was also good to try to give more visibility to this. Now, more broadly, of course, we have tried to contribute to the whole, humanitarian fora and what the strategies that they have been adopting, more specifically with regards to non-governmental controlled areas and contested areas, which are often overlooked and continue to be a humanitarian issue, not only with regards to COVID-19, but along with other thematic areas of focus, such as child protection, sexual violence, etc. So again, we have tried to support a bit the efforts in the development of strategies for other organizations that are operational in those areas. Now, the COVID-19 response monitor, it has had much success, thankfully, and we have been encouraged to expand the COVID-19 response monitor. So we are in our way to expanding to other health crises, including Ebola, measles, polio, and then we're also going to extend to natural disasters such as hurricanes, floods, droughts that actually affect these conflict-affected contexts around the world. So I would say stay tuned for that expansion. It'll be quite interesting. Now, looking more into, broadly speaking, the different responses that you will be able to find in the COVID-19 response monitor. Now, I must say that, you know, as a disclaimer, you will find a great majority of, you know, a broad variety of measures that are perhaps, ones are more formal, you know, based on the structure that is implementing, the arm group that is implementing the measure, and perhaps others that are a bit more low scale measures in the sense that some groups don't have the capability to adopt, you know, very sophisticated measures. So you will see that throughout the response monitor. You will look at more protection driven measures, others that are more health oriented measures, others that are more politically motivated measures that also, you know, we need to consider that, you know, some of these measures can be adopted in the sense that armed groups want to advance their reputation. So this is also something to consider, though we have tried to maintain a level of neutrality with regard to the measures that we have uploading, and following a proper verification triangulation process to make sure that these measures are accurate. So in general, we have seen that after the UN Secretary General called for a ceasefire, armed group responded to this. We can see Philippines with the New People's Army, the BRN in the Alliance in Myanmar, the SOCADEF in Cameroon, and then even gangs in South Africa between, a truce of Americans. It is quite interesting to see how this have developed. Of course, some of these ceasefires, they have been reciprocated, others have not been reciprocated. Something interesting about the global call for ceasefires and this phenomenon is that now civilian audiences are willing to call out different armed groups and request for ceasefires in order to get vaccination within their territories. And this has been the case, for example, in Colombia, where we have indigenous communities, also peasant communities that have been rising with civil society organizations requesting for ceasefires in order to guarantee vaccination in Nariño, for example. So this is something that has been quite interesting. Now, the other very common measure that we have seen are forms of lockdown in general. They really depend on the nature, the objective, and of course, the capacity of the group in order to implement and see this lockdown through. For example, you would look into Eastern Ukraine with the Donetsk People's Republic and the Luhansk People's Republic, which have been, basically implementing lockdowns, including, also self-isolation for those that have been exposed to COVID-19, as well as some gradual easing over time. We've also seen lockdowns by Hamas in 2020, which, a lockdown that was later extended in August of last year. Now, travel and movement restrictions have also been quite frequent with a variety of different groups. Again, these are not all of the groups. There's more groups. You can find more measures in the response monitor, but I've just tried to caption some. For Myanmar, you can look at what the Kachin Independence Organization or the Restoration Council of Shan State have done, restricting movement within their territory and even doing contact tracing when the COVID-19 started, specifically with the Kachin Independence Organization. If we go to Eastern Ukraine, DPR and LPR have also imposed restrictions at border crossings. They've included quarantine requirements for people that are coming within the territory. If we look into Brazil, the Comando Vermelho has also imposed curfews within certain areas that they have influence in. And looking into El Salvador, we have Mara Salvatrucha, who has been enforcing quarantine measures in order to guarantee and to stop the spread within areas, of course, where they exercise influence. Now, there's more measures that are more healthcare specific, I would say. In this, for example, you may look into Myanmar with the Karen National Union that has been creating COVID-19 screening posts in order to make sure that, you know, there is temperature checks, that they do, you know, basically contact tracing as well. And then you also have the Afghan Taliban has been calling for assistance and in order to address the COVID-19 in areas where they are present. And of course, you know, they have pledged to protect anybody who enters their territory in order to work, you know, towards, you know, fighting against the COVID-19 and supporting the population. Now, if we can also look at Al-Shabaab in Somalia, which has created a COVID-19 response committee, a big development, which was a bit of a shift when they first, you know, were aware of the COVID-19. Not a lot was being done, but then with time passed, they saw more and more that, you know, COVID-19 was becoming an issue in areas where they exercise influence. Now, of course, with these responses, a set of challenges have arisen that we have at least noticed within the territories that we operate in. And of course, we have tried to offer solutions to these responses. We have definitely seen that there are a lack of means, including, you know, basic awareness campaigns on the protection of healthcare, or also, you know, they lack personal protective equipment, which has been raised by many armed groups, even publicly in newspapers. So how we have addressed this is that we have indeed, you know, started big campaigns, even through social media, on the protection of healthcare, as well as certain measures that individuals can take in order to avoid the spread of the virus. Of course, following, you know, what health authorities have been, you know, stating in those countries, but as well as, you know, regionally. Now, we have also been, you know, connecting armed groups with aid organizations in some situations where they, you know, they did not have masks, they did not have sanitizers or anything in order to protect themselves from the spread. So we have indeed connected organizations with ANSAs. Now, we've also seen that, you know, the protection of healthcare in armed conflict, there has been some issues with that, recurrent attacks against healthcare, against medical units, not only due to hostilities, but also to, you know, being afraid of, you know, healthcare personnel bringing in the disease to their territories, which is the same situation with communities that are reluctant to engage with humanitarian actors, as they do perceive them as, you know, carriers of the disease within their territories. So having that in mind, of course, within this context, we have indeed tried to promote the deed of commitment on the protection of healthcare, and also a model unilateral declaration on the protection of healthcare, more focused on the situation of COVID, which has been quite successful, I would say, in the Middle East. You can feel free to look at the declarations from Syria and Iraq from a variety of different armed groups, in order to guarantee that the main provisions, that the main obligations are there and that they're aware of them. There's also some technical issues with regards to interpreting or misunderstandings of the protection that medical units are given. So for example, we have seen in certain contexts where, you know, armed groups were not aware that COVID-19 screening posts were protected as long as they were providing, you know, healthcare, you know, that they were providing healthcare, or they were focused on healthcare. So indeed, we have tried to address this and provide a bit more clarity by writing a piece on protection of COVID-19 screening posts, which has been translated in different dialects and shared among different armed groups. Now, of course, the imposition of restrictive measures, a bit excessive restrictive measures in some contexts, has been prevalent, specifically when dealing with lockdowns or restricting movement. Now, in order to address this, we have tried to promote the unilateral declaration, the model unilateral declaration that armed groups could themselves sign, and make sure, you know, that the main provisions, that their main obligations are there and they are aware of that, but also including an aspect of humanitarian assistance and humanitarian access. As you know, humanitarian access has been, you know, quite hindered due to the lockdowns and restriction of movement. So it's been quite important for us to engage with them on those aspects. Now, moving on specifically to armed non-state actors and vaccination. What has happened with armed groups and vaccination? Again, we're discussing equitable access in non-governmental controlled areas and contested areas as a humanitarian imperative, but a quite challenging humanitarian imperative, in the sense that there are some challenges, despite some armed groups, calling for vaccinations publicly and asking for vaccinations and, offering, for security, etc., such as the Afghan Taliban. It still remains challenging to engage ANSAs on these specific topics, because sometimes there's not sufficient command control among the ANSAs. So you may have different districts and provinces that have different authorities, and perhaps are not following the same guidelines as the heads of the organization. So also lack of coordination, lack of communication between them could also be quite challenging. So if I give the example of Afghanistan, if you want to enter non-governmental controlled areas in Kandahar and Kunduz, it's way different. Kandahar is more challenging, whereas Kunduz is quite open, for humanitarian presence in non-governmental controlled areas. Now, there have been some cases of armed groups that have had access to vaccines, such as in Eastern Ukraine, DPR and LPR. They have progressed quite quickly with the vaccine rollout throughout the areas that they control. But it has been quite interesting to see how they have developed and how they have prioritized the different groups for vaccination. In Myanmar, you look at the United Wa State Party and the Kachin Independence Organization, who have also started vaccinations, of course, due to their proximity to China and the relationships that they have with China, as well as with the Chinese Red Cross Society, which has been supporting in the proper administration of vaccines. Now, lastly, and I would say the most recent development is with the autonomous administration in North and East Syria. And I would say it's a big lesson learned, as vaccines were provided to Northeast Syria as part of COVAX. However, an additional agreement, or a tripartite agreement between the government of Syria, WHO, and the AANES has enabled the possibility of vaccine rollout throughout North and East Syria. Indeed, this is the first of the kind, and that can be used as an example for the different contexts. But there are also a set of challenges that we need to consider, which is the capacity to administer. Even if some groups have access to vaccines, the capacity to administer doesn't only mean that you have the vaccine at hand, but it means that you need to keep the vaccine refrigerated. It means that you need to offer proper vaccination by qualified personnel, which sometimes armed groups don't have. And you also need to have personnel that are able to do the follow-up after vaccination. So in case something goes wrong, or there's side effects that are perhaps dangerous, these are aspects that need to be considered. Also, the question of recognition of the vaccines. We have seen that certain vaccines in certain countries mention that they will not recognize the specific vaccines. So if civilians have been vaccinated for example, in DPR areas with Sputnik vaccine, and Ukraine doesn't recognize this, what does this mean? Are these civilians fully vaccinated? How can they move around later if vaccination becomes a requirement? So there's also a big issue of recognition of the vaccines. Now, when we talk about full access to vaccines, we often question, armed groups, what do they mean by full access to vaccines? Because in some situations, you may see an armed group that has, they have basically provided vaccines for members of their ranks, but they have not provided vaccines for civilians that are living in their areas. So in that case, you can't really call it a full access to vaccines, and more work needs to be done, more advocacy, more push for civilians to not be overlooked throughout, the vaccine rollout in those territories. So indeed, I encourage us to, it's an open-ended question, practically, what does it imply for civilians? What does it imply? What does full access to vaccine imply for civilians? Logistically speaking, how can they get themselves to contested areas, knowing that these areas have been closed for 4 years due to constant hostilities? How do you guarantee that they're going to get the post-vaccination treatment in case something goes wrong? So there's many aspects to consider, as well as perhaps, donations by states, and, states that are providing vaccines also need to consider, political damage, due to providing this, or some ethical questions or ethical issues that they need to discuss, before donating vaccines or selling vaccines to armed groups. So indeed, many things to discuss, and I look forward to your questions once we're all done. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Jimena. What I thought was interesting was that how you highlighted that some of the measures or responses that non-state armed groups took to the pandemic were the same as states, or more so than I thought, and also that it's not necessarily about just getting access or your hands on the vaccine, but being able to put together a sensible campaign before, but also after, to make it sustainable, especially for the people who will be getting the vaccine or who are targeted by those measures. So without further ado, we have received a bunch of questions, including very detailed ones. The first one, and I would maybe like to hear the three of you on it, and I might rephrase it in more general terms, but what are the consequences when states do not respect or uphold the rules of international law that protects the provision of healthcare? How do you react to those violations from a legal perspective, but also maybe for Charles, from a more humanitarian diplomacy perspective? And maybe if you could reflect on the situation in Syria, especially you, Jimena, since you also hinted at the fact that Syria is particular because there is this scheme for vaccine distribution under Russia's auspices. So I don't know who wants to, which of you wants to go first?
I can go, but I'm going to pass it on to my colleague. A lot of it, but I mean, because I think the answer really is a bit outside of the law. So I mean, this is an existential kind of question for international lawyers. And the challenge is not so much inherent in the law. Mm-hmm. The problem is a lack of political will sometimes to actually, on the part of states, to actually discharge what they undertook to do. So to discharge their obligations, and also to ensure respect by other states, which is also an obligation that states have that I referred to before. So I mean, that's not a very satisfactory answer, but there is a political challenge. Now, part of the way of meeting that challenge, I think, and this is again extra legal, is to exert a price on states that fail to discharge their obligations, and that's part of the role that civil society has. So, if our representatives operate in a way that contravenes the state's international obligations, then we have to do what we can to exert pressure on them. And states do have an incentive often to at least appear to be respectful of the rule of international law. There's an interest in maintaining legitimacy, and respect for the rule of law is crucial for that. There are certain measures that can be taken when individuals commit violations of international law. But I think the question was more about states and their failure to discharge their obligations. So I realize this isn't a completely satisfactory answer. There's a lot of attempts to grapple with these kind of questions. I don't think we're going to resolve it here.
Thanks. It might not be satisfactory, but at least it is honest. And I think it's important to be honest about the limits of international law and how much its implementation depends from political will. So Charles?
Thanks, Emily. I don't think I'll be any more satisfactory, but hopefully just as honest. I think Eden alluded to it. It is outside the law, and there's this perennial gap between what the law says on paper and how it's implemented in practice. But I think from the ICRC's point of view, it really comes down to one word, and that's persistence, which means engaging with all parties to armed conflicts over a long period of time. And I think often I would not mean to denigrate or to lessen in any way the flagrant violations of IHL that we see around the world. Having said that, I think you never hear about the thousands of airplanes that take off and land every day, nor do you hear about thousands of times, or many times per day, that an ambulance is waved through a checkpoint, and IHL is adhered to. So I think that's really the answer. I think in the case of Syria, that's one probably Ximena is better placed to comment on. But suffice to say, it's a very, very challenging operational context and will remain one for quite some time. Thanks.
Thanks, Charles. Jimena?
Thank you so much for the question. I mean, of course, I agree with Eitan and then Charles in the sense that this it's outside of the law in this sense. But indeed, some consequences, of states not fulfilling responsibility can also be felt by the humanitarian community, which is sometimes there to address the gaps. And it's now become even more challenging. I'm just adding one aspect to this because with regard to vaccination, if we're speaking specifically, because I don't want to duplicate what Eitan and Charles have mentioned, if we're talking about vaccination, now we have the issue of legal liability that is being transferred to humanitarian organizations that are willing to conduct vaccination. And now we have colleagues in MSF, colleagues from the Red Cross movement around the world and other organizations that are willing to support with this, but are limited. So in this sense, that's also an aspect that we need to consider and that I think states must reflect upon because it's, the same obligations, that states have cannot be transferred to humanitarian organizations to fill the gaps. They cannot, it's not possible. This is something that we must reflect on. With regard to Syria, it is quite an innovative, it happened 2 weeks ago, 1 week ago. So it was a situation where all vaccines that were provided by the COVAX program to Northeast Syria were stalled due to their, everybody was on it, wanted to conduct vaccination. There was no organization nor coordination. And therefore the autonomous administration decided to pull the plug on it until there was more coordination, until there was more international involvement. So in this sense, it was not until they agreed on this tripartite agreement, which took a significant amount of time to negotiate. So here, Charles mentions persistence, and it is indeed persistence of WHO, of the autonomous administration, but also of the government of Syria that was willing to provide that, seeing as Northeast Syria was completely left behind. So in the general national vaccination lead. So in this sense, I do remain optimistic. It is challenging, but I do remain optimistic that perhaps this can be, this example, this experience can be shared as a lesson learned for other contexts, which are undergoing similar situations, or perhaps not similar, but that need to be tailored and contextualized to that context. So in this sense, we take the good, we leave the bad, and we work forward with that.
Thanks, Jimena.
Thank you so much.
I will take a question that was asked later on in the chat, but I think is interesting in follow-up to what you just said. When you mentioned that the full scale of the state's responsibility for vaccinations purposes cannot be transferred to humanitarian organization, there has been a very interesting question on sanctions, because basically there are more and more humanitarian exemptions in sanctions regimes. And vaccinations and COVID-19 vaccines are classified as essential humanitarian goods and are within the realm of the exemptions, but the financing is often caught up by sanctions and conditional clause, so it's very difficult for supply chain actors to actually process humanitarian payments for the acquisition of vaccines. So basically, to make it short, the question, and I'd like to hear the three of you, is how do you think that the sanctions in a conflict setting, like the one on Syria, obviously, but others, are affecting current and future supply chain distribution of COVID-19 vaccines, especially in areas controlled by non-state actors? But I guess the reasoning applies to humanitarian goods and healthcare more broadly.
I can have a crack, Emily. I think it's a great question, which I don't have a satisfactory response to either. But I think what I would offer is kind of linking back to the first point that I mentioned about the onus being really on the state to include everybody in their national vaccination plans and activities. Sometimes they're included on paper, but not in practice, and that practice can be due to lack of political will or to capacity constraints. And I think really what we're talking about here is the sort of the fungibility of resources. And I know that sort of the counterterrorism discussion and the sanctions discussion are two different but related ones. And again, I think it comes back to the idea also that vaccines won't help combat the pandemic, also that only vaccination will. And if you have the vaccines but not the necessary equipment and so forth to administer them, then they're not much good. So I'm not sure what the situation of the specific sanctions regimes is, especially in Syria. But if there needed to be further carve-outs for this purpose, I'd say that would be a track to pursue. And I think it was a great point that linked to it that Ximena raised around indemnity and liability, because that is definitely a live discussion that's going on now in the context of the humanitarian buffer, and it is about sort of finding the best and most appropriate arrangement to share the risk so we can get vaccines and vaccinations to people who need them. Thanks.
Thanks, Charles. Jimena or Eitan?
Yeah, I'm looking more at the case of occupied territory in this forum, and so I think it's a little bit different, but I did outline, emphasize before that the occupying power in our analysis actually has the ultimate obligation to ensure that vaccines are provided. And so in the case of an occupation, any kinds of sanctions that result in the population not having access to vaccines entail a breach of that underlying obligation that the occupying power has. So that's a very kind of general response, but I think perhaps that has a little bit to do with the particularities of occupation, where I mentioned before, there's a high degree of control that the occupying power has over the local population, their ability to realize their rights. And perhaps just, I don't know if we'll have time, so just to jump in on this to relate to a kind of another question that was asked. So there were questions about the scope of the services that are being provided, the access that is actually being provided to Palestinians. And it was a specific question about the occupied territory. And so I just want to emphasize the two major concerns that we have, and in a way it links to this. So the one is about the provision of the ultimate responsibility to provide the vaccines. And as I said, this is an obligation that rests with the occupying power on our analysis. Now, in Palestine, vaccines are being provided by other actors. This connects a bit to points that were raised before, but the occupying power, the actor that has the primary responsibility to ensure that vaccines are provided, does not accept that it has this obligation. So, and that has resulted, and this is the other point, in a huge gap in the way vaccines have been provided to different populations under Israeli control. So within its own sovereign territory, COVID-19 seems to have disappeared, really. I mean, there are no cases. People they started off with a campaign to vaccinate very early on, and it's, at the moment, people are continuing with their lives as normal. If you go to the West Bank, it's under the control of the same authority, but there's a huge gap in the level of vaccination. And when you look at Gaza, it's really, really different. I mean, I can perhaps share here on the chat for the benefit of those. In the chat, there's some information here about the numbers. There's a huge gap there. And when you have the same authority responsible for all these populations, ultimately with control, and that kind of discrepancy in the experiences of the people under its control, the issue of discrimination that I mentioned, that's something that under human rights law, and human rights law should inform the interpretation of IHL, that is not something that should be allowed for. And so measures like sanctions and all these other, and really the effort to kind of relieve itself of the obligation and pass it on to the WHO or to all kinds of other international actors, and to say, we'll allow you to provide this assessment, but we don't have any obligation to do that. That is something that's really disturbing, particularly when it feeds into this kind of discrimination between populations, ultimately under the control of the same authority.
Thanks, Eitan. Jimena, do you want to add anything? You're on mute.
Sorry, my Zoom was frozen. Bolivian internet it's quite slow, so sorry about that. No, indeed, of course, I agree with Charles. However, of course, we are a protection organization. We don't provide assistance. So in the sense, perhaps Geneva Call is not the one, in a better place to offer some, information on this as, as a protection organization. We are affected by sanctions, but of course we're affected tangentially. We're not directly affected the way assistance organizations are affected. So indeed, sanctions, they do have humanitarian impact, but I think what's also important is we need to think about sanctions, having impact on, humanitarian impact globally on, the civilian population that is there, the people that need the assistance, but also the impact on the humanitarian organizations as such that are there to try to address some gaps. So it's good to see it as a two-tier approach or two-tier analysis in that sense. And I would say, because since we are a humanitarian organization, I think for humanitarian organizations, we are still at the moment where we're still under discussions, on the burden of proof. Who does it fall under? Should it fall under us humanitarian workers? Who does it fall under? How do we demonstrate that we need to work on this, despite some challenges, despite, the funding issues, or where the money is coming from to acquire the vaccines? So again, I would tend to emphasize, the impact that it does have on the humanitarian organizations as such, but also never leave aside the humanitarian impact that these sanctions have for the civilian population, specifically in non-governmental controlled areas and contested areas. You can look at the situation in Myanmar currently where we have sanctions and we're constantly trying to, we have organizations that are constantly trying to, look at how to proceed as they have completely stalled their operations due to this. Thank you.
Thanks, Jimena. And I mean, I know it's not ideal, but jumping back to what Ethan said before on Israel and Palestine, I think it's also super interesting to realize that in an international armed conflict and in an occupation setting that we consider maybe easier to handle from a legal perspective because we have more rules, implementation of the rules and attribution of responsibility is as important as in non-international armed conflict where we tend to think it's more complicated. We still have about 12 minutes before us, so if there's anybody else who wants to ask a question on the chat, please do so. Otherwise, I will ask our panelists if there's anything else they want to react, comment on, mention. So let's just see if something pops up on the chat. And thanks, Charles, for the food for thought.
Emily, I saw there was an earlier question. If I got it correctly, I might try and take it up. It was a question about, I suppose, kind of, this isn't exactly the way it was worded, but I think the idea was what happens when an occupying power cynically uses the occupied territory and its population for kind of experimenting on the utility of vaccine.
You're right. Thank you for
pointing that out. So I mean, I think the standard there would be the same as the standard in relation to its own population. So just because you control these people by virtue of occupation and it's not part of the state's sovereign territory, it doesn't mean that it can turn them into guinea pigs and that they lose the kinds of protections that the other the nationals of the state have. And so if this kind of practice is prohibited, and I would imagine it is within certain parameters, certain boundaries, then it would be prohibited equally in occupied territory as in non-occupied territory. You can't, the law of occupation and human rights law that continues to apply, would not allow subjecting people to, unless it was done under conditions where it would be permissible in the state's own domestic territory. But yeah.
Yeah. Jimena, do you want to maybe reflect on this for territories controlled by non-state armed groups?
Honestly, Emily, I would need you to repeat the question. I was a bit sidetracked with the message from the field, sorry.
No worries. So it's a question about, I mean, the question was specifically on occupied territory, but basically what would happen, or would it be possible that an authority in control of a territory basically uses the population it controls for the sake of medical testing, for instance?
What responsibility they would have for that?
Yes.
Okay. So of course, I mean, as Eitan was mentioning, it's not quite different. You know, of course, this is prohibited under human rights law, regardless of whether this is non-governmental controlled areas, governmental controlled areas, contested areas, regardless of what it is. Now, if the armed group has, of course, de facto control over that specific territory, then they would be, responsible for those acts, of course, and would be responsible of, initiating investigations if required to, as well as, starting a whole, accountability process in making sure, that victims are, compensated in a way. And, so it's quite challenging because it also depends on the capacity of the armed group to do this, to follow up on this, to initiate an investigation, to be accountable on this and offer compensation to victims and victim families. So indeed, of course, this is not in line in human rights law. It would not be in line with international humanitarian law either, as it would go against human dignity and life.
Thanks, Jimena. And I guess also, the provision of human treatment in all circumstances is also very relevant.
Yeah.
So we haven't had any additional questions, and I don't think I've forgotten any at this stage. So maybe I could ask each of you to say a few words of wrap up, or if there's anything you'd like to comment on that we haven't addressed or sufficiently addressed at the moment. Charles, do you want to go first?
Sure, thanks, Emily. I think I'd reiterate my main message, which is that despite all the challenges that we have talked about, we can do this, and it is possible. We have done it with routine vaccinations before, even if there are still 10 million people or 10 million kids who have not touched routine vaccinations before. But I think one real point of reflection, which is being sort of taken upon by member states in the context of WHA, is about how we can strengthen the overall public health architecture with the international health regulations that we have and other measures. And I think when we speak about non-state armed groups and the question that Erica mentioned about kind of the fungibility or touching on the fungibility of resources, we need to think about how we can reach people, which again, by our estimates, are in the 60 to 80 million people, without talking about or without creating parallel healthcare systems. So I think if there's something that comes out of this pandemic more longer term too, when hopefully the better parts of the world are done and vaccinated, that will be a big thing to pause and reflect on. Thank you.
Thanks. Eitan or Jimena?
Yeah, I can have a go. So again, I'll also reiterate a point that I tried to convey before. And I think that what's really important to convey is that the obligations that states have, including occupying powers, with respect to vaccines and I suppose health rights more generally, are a function of the control that they have over the people and I suppose the medical needs of the population. So their nationality or their ethnic identity or their gender identity, all these other kinds of factors are not relevant. The fact that somebody is a citizen of the state and somebody else is a protected person in occupied territory is not a reason to distinguish between them in ensuring that they receive these kinds of vaccines. Unfortunately, that doesn't seem to be the way things are playing out in practice. And also reiterate that the obligations with respect to providing vaccines for COVID-19 and securing the right to health more broadly do not rest only with the parties which have direct control, but there's also a responsibility that the international community has to ensure realization of that right to the fullest extent possible. So those would be points that and just another little thing, I mean, you said it in a way, but just this issue of experimentation, of course, that would also be a violation of IHL. So experimenting on people in occupied territories is also prohibited under the law of occupation. Important to highlight that. So thanks a lot.
Thanks, Aidan. Jimena?
Thank you, Emily. Actually, I've been, thinking about a question for Charles for some time. So I'm very sorry to come with this question quite late. But Charles, I perhaps would like to hear a bit from you on what you think about this legal liability being transferred to humanitarian organizations. How is the ICRC going about this in the different contexts? As of course, it really depends on each state. Each state is dealing with it in a different way. And how are you moving forward with this?
It's a great question, Jimena. We need we need a lot longer than 5 minutes to bottom it out, because it's an ongoing discussion, definitely. And I think, you know, our position is pretty clear. And I think that the arrangement with respect to COVID vaccines or vaccinations is not a normal one, in that they were developed so quickly that there aren't sort of, for example, insurance products that would ordinarily cover them. And if you look at other mechanisms that exist for rapid distribution of vaccines in humanitarian settings, like the ICG, the International Coordinating Group, the situation there is that the companies would take on liability for their products. Obviously, that wouldn't extend to a humanitarian organization that, for example, didn't maintain the cold chain. But I think that's where we're working towards. That's the end that we're working towards, that the companies would take on liability for the use of their products with the necessary carve-out. So I think that's where it should be going from a humanitarian perspective. That's where certainly we would be seeking to take the discussions. But like I say, this is definitely an ongoing discussion, and I wouldn't want to anticipate or jinx the outcome. Thanks.
Thanks, Charles. Jimena, anything else you want to add?
Thank you. No, I think it's very good, and also for my colleagues in the field, because I was reminded, you know, please ask them what's going on. So they're also listening. They're, you know, tuning in. They're quite interested in knowing, because they constantly get questions from local civil society organizations. So everything that has been shared by Aitan and Charles is well received by the field. No, but from my side, definitely. Of course, the issue, I mean, we tend to think a lot about, you know, territories that are controlled by armed groups. And it's okay, we need to consider those territories. But what happens with territories where you have armed groups that perhaps don't control territory and are afraid, you know, of vaccination, because they think that they're going to get, you know, they're not going to get vaccination. They're just going to get killed with what they get, you know, injected. So there's also, you know, room in the sense that there needs to be much advocacy on vaccination, much information sharing. I still think that much can be done with regard to discussing about vaccines, what can be done not only in non-governmental controlled areas, but also contested areas and areas where armed groups don't really control territories, but civilians are still stuck there. So again, I would try to emphasize that if we're going to talk about full access to vaccines means that not only the armed group will be able to receive vaccines, but also civilian populations living in those territories as well. So it's quite important to emphasize that, and for armed groups to have, you know, the different prioritizations, you know, in place, have certain policies in place on how to proceed with vaccination. And in general, I would tend to support, you know, tripartite agreements, you know, that perhaps would be more, you know, of a confidence building, you know, exercise between, you know, armed groups, governments, and health organizations. So indeed, this could be something that can be replicated in different contexts that are perhaps, you know, facing some challenges with regard to access to vaccines. Thank you, Emily.
No, thanks a lot. Thanks so much to the three of you. What I take out from this conversation is that organizing effective vaccination campaigns in armed conflict setting is possible. However, that it's about ensuring not only a rollout, but a rollout that allows for full access to vaccine to those in need. That full access means that vaccinations are distributed based on needs. That in occupied territory, it means that the citizens of the occupying power, but the local population under its control should be treated in equal measure and have equal access to vaccines. In the case of armed non-state actors, active in territories, not necessarily just controlling them, it means also confidence building measures. To make sure that there is trust between the local authorities or the authorities having the vaccines and then the people receiving it or administering it. And also that in all contexts, states involved in the conflict, but also third states have a role to play based on the law, but also on human values, morality, and humanitarian diplomacy. So I hope that was an accurate summary. Thanks again for your participation. Thank you to everybody who tuned in. Please look at the resources that Eitan, Jimena, but also Charles either mentioned or put it in the chat. And stay tuned for a next IHL talk next week, and then we'll take a break for the summer. And without further ado, happy morning, evening, afternoon to everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, Emily.